So, my name is Cliff Robinson, and I am the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. This morning's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as were the pastries, coffee, and tea supplied by the Jam and Community Cafe just outside. So, it is my honor to introduce our guests, Allison Pugh and Shamus Khan. Allison Pugh, the author of the title we are here to discuss today, is Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at the University of Virginia. Her previously published books include The Tumbleweed Society, Working and Caring in an Age of Insecurity and Longing, and Belonging, Parents, Children, and Consumer Culture. Her writing has also appeared in leading publications such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The New Republic. Allison is joined in conversation this morning by Shamus Khan, Willard Thorpe Professor of Sociology and American Studies at Princeton University, where he also serves as the Director of Gender and Sexuality Studies. He is the author of over 120 articles, books, and essays, including Privilege, The Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, and Sexual Citizens, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus with Jennifer Hirsch. Allison and Shamus have joined us this morning to discuss The Last Human Job, published by the Princeton University Press earlier this year in June. The book explores how the rapid development of artificial intelligence and labor-saving technologies like self-checkouts and automated factories have made the future of work ever more uncertain, so that even jobs requiring high levels of human interaction are no longer safe. The publisher writes, "The Last Human Job explores the human connections that underlie our work, arguing that what people do for each other in these settings is valuable and worth preserving." The title opens up and elucidates a concept of connective labor, that is, labor that enriches the lives of individuals and binds our communities together. This title is a compelling argument for us to recognize value and protect humane work in an increasingly automated and disconnected world. So The Last Human Job is available in the library's collection, though there are currently 4 holds on the library's copy, so I recommend purchasing one for yourself today if you are especially eager to get started after hearing about the book this morning. So thanks to Labyrinth Books for coming out to support the signing, which will follow immediately after today's program. With all that said, let's thank Allison and Shamus for coming to the library this morning.
Thank you and welcome all. I thought I would just quickly thank the library for this and all the events that it puts forth here for our community. It's so meaningful, so thank you to all of you who are here on a Sunday morning helping bring us together. I want to thank Allison for coming to us to Princeton. She'll also be talking tomorrow at 3 o'clock about the future of economic sociology within the sociology department. So as a sociologist, I get to spend several hours with Allison while she's here. I want to thank Labyrinth for being here to make the book accessible to people who must have it now, and I feel hopefully many of you will leave in that way. And then to give you a sense of the run of show today, I'm going to ask Allison, and I want to thank Princeton University Press, many of whom are here, my colleagues there, for publishing this book and helping organize so much of Allison's conversations around the country. So the run of show, I'll ask Allison some questions, sort of get us a lay of the land of what the book is about. The argument, kind of lay it out a bit like that. And then instead of sort of me talking with Allison for 40 minutes, I'll probably open it up so the Q&A portion will be a little more interactive, but I may interrupt the Q&A as well to ask some of my own questions.
Or chime in.
Chime in, yeah. So I want to start with a really basic question. Why did you write this book, and how did you write it? How did you come about? What was it that you drew upon? What was the inspiration for writing this book?
Yeah, thank you. And let me add my thanks to all who have organized this. It's such a blessing and an opportunity to talk to people in person about this book. I actually also want to thank you all for taking the time out of your Sunday morning to come, especially after daylight savings, which I know we're supposed to be happy that we got an extra hour, but it always is intrusive and complex and difficult. So how did I write this book? So I came to this book, I've always cared about like kind of relationship and how people connect. That's a theme across all my work. But in particular, I came to write this book because I wrote an article for sociologists that was had an impact at that point about in-depth interviewing. And in-depth interviewing is actually how I do my how I do my work, how I collect my research, do my research and collect my data. And the in-depth interviewing process is actually like I sit with you for an hour or 2 or 3, and I'm not just writing down what you say. I'm not a stenographer. I actually am kind of trying to hear what you're not saying and just reflect back to you my impressions. And together, you might be like, that's not quite right. It's more like this. Together, we construct some kind of version of your truth. And that's all I'm after. But it's much more than just the language that you're speaking. It's your body language. It's our collective effort, our cooperative effort. And at the end, people often say, oh, that was just like therapy. And so I started to think like, that's interesting. And I started to think about all the other practices or jobs, occupations that rely on this kind of reflective seeing of the other. I know that I find it profoundly meaningful to do that. And I started to think about other parts of my job that involve that. For example, PhD advising is 100% this job, where you're like you're not telling them this is the dissertation you need to write. Instead, you're kind of saying, what's your truth? What's the story you need to tell? And coaxing that out of someone requires a kind of reflective give and take that I started to think needed a name. And that's how I came up with connective labor. It was just my term for it. I decided it needed a name because once I kind of identified it, I was seeing it everywhere. I was seeing it in coaching. I was seeing it in teaching, obviously. I was seeing it in primary care. I was seeing it in hairdressers. I was seeing it all over. That was actually quite a joyful time where I was like, oh my God, them too, And so I started to notice that. That was kind of joyful and interesting. But I also started to kind of worry about it and think about how we often take it for granted. Employers often are kind of loading on other tasks to people who want to do this work, but also have to, do a lot of data gathering or, other tasks. People take it for granted. They often assume it's something women can do, essentialize it as women's nature, ignore it when men do it. So I started to see how we were taking it for granted. That was another reason why I wanted to highlight it. And then finally, I started to worry about the way we are worry about the impact of kind of data analytics and how we're trying to control and commodify and predict it. And the impact of the kind of the imposition of systems on this kind of particular emotional connection, that seemed to be a tension that I kept seeing everywhere. I knew it in my own work, could see it in teachers, could see it in, so I was like, that needs to be investigated. And that was the beginning of the book. I can go on, but I'll stop there.
I think maybe it would be helpful to sort of build out the concept a little bit of connective labor.
Sure.
And in the book, you sort of outline, 3 primary elements to it. So the one that you just talked to us about, empathetic listening, and the sort of necessity of that in the interviewing that you've done. A second, sort of emotional labor, which I'll say a little bit more about, and then the third, I think, is witnessing. So emotional labor, in particular, is interesting because I think the concept, both really, or not emotional labor, emotion management, builds off this idea that's in other parts of your work and part of the work that's really inspired you through Arlie Hawkshield's work. Like this concept of the way that we don't just through connective labor emotionally connect or empathize with people, but we also do some work and management of our emotions through that. And so I wondered if you could talk to me about these 3 elements. So you sort of said a little bit about empathetic listening, but what emotion management and what witnessing are as part of connective labor.
Yes, I can do that. I can do that best by a story, maybe. So I open the book with a story of this woman, this chaplain, Erin, who I was so lucky to be able to follow. That was one of the great things about writing this book, is that it gave me a chance to spend all this time with master connectors and feelers. So it was I felt so much gratitude because they were beautiful people to spend time with. And so here I am with this chaplain. And she tells me this story about this man who she was doing her rounds in the hospital, and he had been intubated, and so he couldn't talk. And he was rageful about being intubated, really didn't want to be intubated. Medication meant he couldn't write, so he couldn't communicate, and he was just kind of trapped and furious. And she sees this, and she goes, take this Kleenex box and, throw it against the wall. And he just felt so seen at that moment that he grabs her hand and her arm, and he pulls her in, and she sits with him for 10 minutes or something like that. And then the next day or 2 days later, she sees him. He was extubated. He lives through his procedure, and he was extubated, and he's able to talk. And he said, there is nothing like being seen by another person when you're at the worst moment of your life. And that was so profound for her, obviously for him, clearly. And it was this kind of, reciprocal thing where he's telling her he feels seen. She's trying to see him. He's telling her he feels seen. That reciprocity is part of it. That's the witnessing part. Her emotion management is where she's not like bleeding emotionally over him. She's not like, here's how I feel. No. She's like just trying to control her own motion and see him. Yeah. So that's really what connective labor is. Now, I should tell you the other part about the reason why I started with her is she really illustrates the other part. Because Erin, she was beautiful. She's, walking around praying with people, singing to patients, doing, giving, kind of spiritual solace to people in their worst moments. And at the same time, she had to enter data about what she was doing on 3 different platforms in the hospital. One of them being Epic, the standard electronic health record, but there were actually 2 others that her supervisor just kind of put in there for their own interest, collecting data about what she's doing. And she's like, okay, holding hands as a resource, family as a resource, kind of trying to match codes to what she was doing. No one is billing anybody for what Erin does. So why are we collecting data about this chaplain? It just kind of crystallized, and it actually was not without impact. She was deciding which units to go on the hospital based on which computers worked the best. She, sometimes the computers would freeze, and then she'd have to re-enter everything. It was not without impact on her, kind of on a job that was really about connecting and seeing the other. It was like a perfect crystallization about what I saw across my sample. To use the word sample is so dehumanizing, forgive me, across the people I spoke to, which were largely, I should tell you, 3 groups. I spoke to therapists, also primary care physicians, and teachers, and then a 4th group of people who didn't require a college degree. So that would be hairdressers and sex workers, and home health care aides, and a whole bunch of different people in that pop. And then also a bunch of engineers. And why did I include the engineers? Because in 2015, when I started this book, started doing the research for this book, the only other people who were really focused on this collision I was telling you about between this emotional, particular kind of human work and its systematization, how do we make it more predictable and more controllable, were AI engineers. And socio-emotional AI was at the time, and I think maybe still is, the fastest growing sector of AI research and technology. So that's why I interviewed all those engineers.
Yeah, I mean, it got me thinking, the previous institution that I was at was sort of the home of social network analysis. There were so many people who did it. And social network analysis as a tool emerged out of someone who actually did their PhD here in physics and moved over to being a social scientist. And part of what he was interested in is like, what if the people didn't matter at all? And what if what mattered was the structure of their connections? So what if we didn't need to know anything about you? All we needed to know was, how were you connected to other people? And it's a really interesting form of analysis because it gets depopulated. Like, people don't have attributes, they just have positions within what's called a network structure. So we'll get to that in a moment, but I just want to take one step back first and just ask, like, so this is, I'll stick with the medical analogy, right? This is kind of a treatment for something that you have diagnosed as a problem in a society. So
what's the treatment? What do you mean?
the connective labor
Oh,
can
yeah.
be a
Sorry.
can be a treatment for what you describe as sort of depersonalization, or this kind of the depersonalization of society. So can you tell me a little bit more about your diagnosis? Like, what is depersonalization, and how do we experience it in our lives today?
Okay. Yes. Because I actually don't just say, oh, there's depersonalization. I say, we face a depersonalization crisis. Yep. So I actually think it's bigger than just floating around. It's actually a major problem. And I actually start that by noting that you've heard, I assume, about the loneliness crisis. You know, that there's even our Surgeon General has written something about loneliness. There is a lot of loneliness for sure. You know, Britain and Japan have named ministers of loneliness. It's a widespread, people are talking a lot about that. However, social scientists actually don't really agree about loneliness. The data, the research is not obvious. It's actually conflicting, contradictory. So, like, for instance, people, often name the same number of confidants or friends that they used to name, 20 years ago or 40 years ago, or et cetera. That research is not saying loneliness doesn't matter. Loneliness matters. We know loneliness matters. It has a huge impact on physical well-being and mental health. But is it worse than it was before? Or it's not clear. And we also know that different pockets of populations are lonelier, like old people are lonely, and actually young people are lonely. It's the people in the middle that are too busy to be lonely, maybe, or I'm not sure why, but anyway. Yeah, so we know that loneliness matters, and we know that there's pockets of people that are lonely, but it's not clear it's worse. What I think is worse is depersonalization. I'm going to give you another example, another little story. Another of my profound blessings, or something for which I'm grateful for, is that I was able to observe in this kind of extraordinary private school in Silicon Valley that was trying to disrupt education. And the way they did that was the kids learned on machines in the morning, and then they had, half an hour every once in a while with a one-on-one with somebody to ask them how they're doing and stuff like that. I have a long conversation, I think it's a super interesting example of the kind of one version of the future. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it in the book. But I open that chapter with, or, somewhere in the chapter, I talk about having seen a little redheaded boy. I think he was about 5 or 6, very young, and he was doing his math on his, pad, whatever, tablet or whatever, and he's like, what's 5 plus 3? 8, right? And like, no one hears him because they're all doing their thing too, and they have their headphones on also, and the only one who hears him is me. And then at another point, he's like, yes, and he is excited again. He's like pumping his arm again. It's only me, And while that's an extreme school, obviously we're not seeing that everywhere, although may I say COVID saw more of that happen than we might like. But I did feel like it captured something about what our existence is kind of trending towards, which is a lot of individualized experience tailorized to you, customized to you. He was being fed what's called a personalized education, in the most oxymoronic term, because there is no person involved. So I really actually want us to call this customized or tailored or something, but not personalized. But anyway, so big tech offers personalized education, but they do it through a machine. And so he's being seen on some level. This is the level, this is what you're ready for in addition or whatever. But what if we need to be seen, not just for the sake of being seen, but by a human being? And that's what we need to kind of think about and prioritize. And that's what makes this kind of personalized education, I'm going to call it customized for now. Well, customized education or customized medicine, this is also happening in medicine, where you get very tailored, kind of, diagnoses or medications, et cetera, tailored to you without the person. And part of the reason why I wrote this book was to highlight what it is that people do in these interactions. What do they do for each other? Why is that valuable? And how we might better preserve that.
So, this is, I think, a nice transition to thinking a little bit about AI, which is one of the main things that you're grappling with in the book.
Yeah.
And what it struck me in reading through it was you're bringing forth a kind of different kind of conversation about AI. So much of the conversation about AI is like, is this the end of the world? Is this the beginning of a glorious new future? It's a kind of a very binary thinking, right?
To be sure.
Good, bad. And I wonder, what are we missing in our conversation about AI right now? And how does this sort of analytic that you bring about connective labor and all of this sort of, repersonalizing our accounts of education or medicine or anything like that, how is that sort of giving us a different way to view or understand what's happening with this AI transformation?
I love that question. Thank you, Shamus. Perfect. Okay, so, first of all, what are we missing? This is, to me, there is no shortage of critique of AI, but it's generally focused on three things. It's focused on job disruption, to be sure. It's focused on surveillance, right on, and it's focused on bias. And all three of those are super important. I'm not saying they're not important, but what they are missing is relationship and what humans do for each other. And no one is talking about that. And you kind of wonder why no one's talking about that. But here, I'm trying to actually put that on the table. So that's the first thing. But also, I really appreciate your framing there. It's really the first time in one of these book events someone has put that framing on of like, this is more than a binary. Because something I was careful to say when I did my talks out on the West Coast, I am not a Luddite. I believe in AI. I believe in science. I vaccinate my children. Like all that stuff, and AI, can do wondrous things. Do I even need to, I'll give you two. For example, I read recently they invented, or with the help of AI, humans invented 10 new potential antibiotics for drug-resistant bacteria in hospitals. Like, how amazing is that? That's incredible. And then, I love, my personal favorite is the decoding of what sperm whales say. It turns out they're talking to each other, and they needed AI to be able to figure that out. So that's really interesting. So great. I'm all in favor of that. What I am not in favor of is AI that intercedes, that intermediates between human beings. And I actually have started to ask audiences, as you go out into this world, to think about applying a kind of connection metric to what is worthwhile and what we should be encouraging and what we should not be encouraging about AI. We are right now in a complete Wild West. There is almost zero regulation happening of AI in the United States, I should specify. And And so, and that's not the way it should be, and it's not the way it has to be. If we apply a connection metric, we can be like, this one, yes, this one, no, this one, a little bit, but let's fix it in this way. Like I just want us to be more, find the middle ground between, panic and total capitulation or total embrace. And I say, just to add parenthetically, universities completely typify that run from basically ignorance to panic to total capitulation. Like I should say my former, I'm now no longer at UVA, I'm now at Johns Hopkins, but he didn't know that, so that's fine. But anyway, at my former employer, it was like, oh God, AI, the kids are all going to be doing, all going to be plagiarizing. It's only oral exams from now on, or whatever. I don't know. People are panicking. And now it's like, well, how are you incorporating AI into your lesson plan? And it's like, wait a minute, is there a middle ground here? Yeah. So anyway, I have a lot more to say. Yeah. In fact, I think the most interesting, the thing I really want to talk about, maybe we can talk about later, or maybe I'll just throw it at you now. I'm going to give it to you now because it's really important. And that is, the reason why it's important is I think that it inoculates you against the hype that is out there. So this is what I want you to notice. There are 3 ways AI is sold to you. The first is that it's better than nothing. You have all heard that. I barely need to explain it. It's like when people have, no access, low-income people don't get to have can't get into cheap therapy. So let's just give them a therapy bot. You hear this, it's like, it's better than nothing. Of course, realize that what that means is we're embracing a situation where rich people can have an artisanal, human, fantastic therapist, and then poor people just get it from a bot, and that has to be kind of not tenable for us. That situation is deeply problematic. I hope you see. But then there's 2 other ways. Maybe I won't go into them, and I'll just hope that seeds your interest. If you want to be inoculated, if you want the armor against how AI is sold to you, you really need to know in advance so you can be like, that's an AI is better than nothing argument, and I know what that means, and I actually know why that's a fallacy or what fallacy that depends upon, et cetera.
So this is going to be, I'm going to open it up after this. So if you're roaring up to get a question in, it'll just be after this one. I think, the therapy example is a really interesting one, right? Because we now are moving to a world where there's AI that could intervene in people's mental health as a form of therapy. Mm-hmm. But one of the preconditions of that was the development of a therapeutic form, cognitive behavioral therapy, which allowed for analytics and all kinds of evaluations of if this is suggested and then this is the outcome, how do we think through this? And I'm curious, sometimes when we use the word AI, we're not very specific about what we mean. So I hear people talk about AI all the time, and I'm like, that's just data analysis. It's not, there's no artificial intelligence that we're talking about here. It's basic data analytics. And so I wondered if you could help me with the sort of long arc of the transition about how we got here, and talk a little bit, go back to those engineers and think about, tell us a little bit about how we got from sort of data analytics to AI, or how data analytics fits within this and what those engineers are doing.
Thank you also for that question. Fabulous. Because sometimes people get confused, why are we talking about AI? I thought we were talking about the electronic health record. How are those related? And they are related. And that's another thing I need you all to notice, because maybe I'll tell you a story. One of these engineers, he was telling me, he was making a therapeutic agent mostly for veterans on a better than nothing argument, because they don't go to human, there's stigma and they don't want to go to human, so maybe they'll go to this, that kind of thing. And he's telling me, he was really a smart guy out at USC. And he was telling me that, really AI is just about, it's not going to, take over for your favorite teacher, therapist, doctor is just going to take care of the things that are rote. So it's like the rote activity. And so, an intake nurse, some people might call that not rote because it's a nurse, but on some level, this is his language, it's just asking a bunch of questions. So I happen to have an intake nurse in my sample who I had been talking to, and she talked a lot about how the hospital where she was employed, a VA hospital, she was a psychologist kind of, or a psychological nurse, intake counselor kind of. And she had been told that she had to implement this survey, and it had to take her 15 minutes. And that was her job, like to get people through on 15 minutes. And she thought of that as a terrible, terrible thing, and gave me an example of a recent example she had where a man had come in, with suicide ideation. And apparently in this survey, the question about suicidal ideation is like question 14, and question 15 is, do you have the means to do it, or something like that. And she said, as soon as he got to the question number 15, he said, I'm not answering this anymore, and he pushed those away. And she was just like, I'm not gonna spend 15 minutes just so I can, be like, oh, that's great, what kind of services do you need? And like, it turned her, the imposition of these data metrics that she had to collect on behalf of the hospital turned her a bit into a kind of scripted automaton that makes her job more rote, which you can tell from the USC engineers' comments, makes it more susceptible to AI. It is a continuum starting from this artisanal, kind of really uniquely different with each person, kind of tailored experience of, human to human seeing. And then the more scripted and the more we impose kind of industrial model on this work, the more rote it becomes, and the more kind of susceptible to automation and AI. And I actually call that the automation frontier. And I kind of point out how so much of this, the fights or the arguments, so much of what's happening is people are contesting what is rote and what is not rote. And it's a contest that I believe is a little bit slanted towards the people who want to kind of systematize because of the kind of dominance of the industrial model, of efficiency, of the market, of evidence-based medicine, of like all these things that try and impose standards on the woolly, chaotic magic that is what happens between people.
Yeah, it reminds me of this, at the end of the economic crisis from sort of 2008 to 2010, 11, people started to analyze, like, why was it that we got the problem with mortgage-backed securities? And one of the theories that was developed through the social sciences was called performativity. And the idea was that lots of people started to use a particular model or analytic framework to figure out what the values of assets would be. Black-Scholes Merton, actually someone won a Nobel Prize in economics for developing it. And the idea of performativity was that if all of us start to believe in or embrace a model, we improve the predictive capacity of that model, right? So like basically if everyone thinks like an economist, economic reasoning becomes more predictive, becomes more predictively accurate. But the insight was also that systemic risk then becomes much more likely but less visible. And so part of what you're saying there kind of reminds me of these different analyses of economic dynamics. So I have a few more questions, but I wanted to see if anybody else had something that they wanted to add to the conversation before I do. Yes, please. And would you just introduce yourself? Yes.
I'll ask that you wait for a microphone too, just so everyone can hear. Here you are.
And just if you don't mind introducing yourself, you don't have to, but it's nice to connect a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm really talking to both of you, and I want to give you some positive information about this. I think it is I usually avoid information on AI. Anything technological, I avoid if I can. But, you know, about maybe several months, maybe 6 months ago, longer, I happened to read in the New York Times a story about AI, and it involved a lot of people. It was an AI, I guess you call it bot, whatever, that helped doctors, especially oncologists, who had to address people with very sad information that there was no chance for them. And what this AI information told the doctor is a lot of empathic statements, like, you know, I understand, is there anything I can do, whatever, but they were empathic. And I remembered that. And then I just let it go, and I went to my own physician a while later with a concern I had, and I was really upset about it. And this doctor, he shall remain unnamed, he's a wonderful doctor. He was my primary. He is a rather straightforward person, objective. I don't usually hear anything from him that's emotional. And so I was telling him the story about what was happening, members of my family, and I really was upset and sad. And he said nothing, and then he walked over to me. He put his hands on my shoulders. Never happened before. And he said to me, I really understand you. I am so sorry that this is happening. I wish there was something I could do. And I was stunned. This was so unlike him. But I immediately felt better, really felt better. And before I left, I said to him, you know, you really should consider being a therapist. That was so helpful to me. I happen to be a psychotherapist of 30-some years. So I left. And then I read some other information about this same bot or whatever it was. And thousands of doctors across America were using this same one because they had such difficulty expressing or providing that kind of unhappy news to people. I'm sort of catching up with you a little bit that there are very positive things that can be done with it and very effective. And it was about relationship. It was about relationship. A doctor was given information. In a way, he used that. He created a better relationship with his client.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Or comment. I would say for sure, and perhaps some of you have read, like there's been a bunch of articles in like the British Journal of Medicine, et cetera, finding that AI does better than doctors in blinded experiments where, you know, patients will like kind of, this is a staged experiment, so I don't really know. But anyway, patients will, you know, say they have something, and then they'll not know who's responding, the bot or the actual physician. And the bot is much more like, that sounds difficult. And, you know, and the human physicians will go straight into, well, have you tried? No. You know, and it is certainly true, for example, maybe you've seen studies that like, you know, U.S. doctors wait 7 seconds before interrupting the patient who comes and talks to them. So, you know, kind of preemptory or too kind of, you called it straightforward. That's a nice way of putting it. Too straightforward interactions is a problem in American medicine. And B, you know, bots can perform seeing in a way that can feel effective to the people on the other end. Both of those are true. However, I'll say a couple things here. This brings up actually a second way that AI is sold to us. You heard the better than nothing. Also better together. AI will augment human behavior. Maybe you've heard that elsewhere. That's a very common way. It's often the way Silicon Valley talks about it because it's more palatable, because people will feel like they're not about to lose their job. It's just going to make us uber performers, you know, that kind of thing. But I'll speak to that general problem and then this specific one. The general problem is that relies on a huge fallacy of the idea that we're going to be freed up. Maybe you've heard that language. Humans will be freed up to do more meaningful work. That's the better together. And that's a fallacy because employers are not looking for ways to feed us more meaningful work if our work can be done by machine. So that is, not happening. But anyway, back to the doctors. When I speak to practitioners, I'll answer it in two ways. The first is when I speak to practitioners, they are like, because you feel judged or bad because you've had bad connective labor or you've experienced kind of preemptory or not being seen does not mean the answer is to mechanize that encounter. Instead, we should, kind of train, give people better staffing, kind of not make things so rushed, et cetera. We should address the working conditions through which the humans provide this rather than kind of being like, well, how can we fix this with technology? Because the how can we fix this with technology is really an American kind of malady. That's number one. And number two, there are studies that show that the more time compressed doctors in particular feel, the kind of more they rely on stereotyping and bias and other things that kind of cloud our seeing. So that's a lot to say, a lot against, kind of the mechanization of medicine. I would address what you're saying, which is a little gentler, like just a reminder. Hi, be more empathetic. To me that I'm like, if we can apply our connection metric, to me that sounds okay. But I would want it to be really limited. And may I say, that already exists. There's something called the BATHE script, which is, I'm actually not going to be able to reproduce it. It's a kind of checklist for doctors about remembering empathy. And it's like, I can't remember what all the BATHE stands for, but E is empathy. How's that making you feel or whatever? Like it's a checklist. So we don't really need AI to give us a checklist on how to be empathetic. I'm so pleased it's working for the thousands of doctors or whatever, but I want us to be judicious about where we let in the machine to a human encounter. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me kind of there's a capacity for it to be delivered at scale, which is one of the things. But
Scale.
Yeah, and I'll get back to this in a moment. But it also reminded me of it's a classic book of history called More Work for Mother, and it's about how all of these technological innovations that came through the 20th century were supposed to save time. So Ruth Cowan wrote this book. And what she noted was that what it really did was actually create increased sets of expectations and didn't save time at all for household labor that primarily women were doing, but actually transformed the expectations and to a degree created higher time crunches. And I think one of the things that comes through in this book so much is that a lot of these interventions are meant to save time, and the thing like connective labor takes time, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a kind of inherent tension there. I saw a hand up just over here. Yes, please. Can you wait just one moment until you get a microphone? Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much to everyone, to the author, and also, of course, to the publisher and the organizer. It's a wonderful topic. What I feel is that, I think that it's a wonderful topic because I think human interconnectivity or connectivity is an innate human needs, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that the wonderfulness of you're touching on the topic is that with the AIs coming over, so it might came to a conjuncture that it's like a intershaping, it's like this AI, is it like a changing our nature of being connected with each other? And on the other hand, our, it's like it might reinforce each other, right? It's with being disconnected. Is it changing our human nature? And meanwhile, what our human nature do can, work on this AI part. So I think it's really great. You touch on that. I'm wondering how your research how how it's received in the West Coast. You know. Thank you.
That's a good question. I was afraid. I really went right into the belly of the beast. So I gave talks in, in Palo Alto and in Berkeley and in Seattle, and also Whidbey Island, which is an offshoot of Seattle. And the best one was Whidbey Island.
Can you explain what that is?
Why it was the best
Yeah,
one?
well, yeah, or what it is, like,
Whidbey
yeah.
is just an island just off of Seattle. You have to take a ferry to get into it, but it's very close. But the thing that made it, anyway, you were asking what is the West Coast response? I would say, there are I think it wasn't that different. I expected it to be like, I don't know, something more hostile or something, I'm not sure. And it wasn't that different. It was people, I think, are broadly concerned about AI. It helps that I've interviewed so many engineers, so I kind of know what they think, know how they, what their arguments are, and I've heard them before. So I have opinions about them, and I can have like a conversation with them about it. So their questions weren't surprises to me. But also they're not monolithic, and they often are, kind of trying to make the world a better place. It's a cliche, but it is true for many there. So we can have that conversation. The thing that I'm out here kind of evangelizing about, is that I want us to start talking about relationship, and they haven't really. And so I'm just trying to put that on the table. They're used to, for instance, defending themselves against you're ruining the world because everything's going to be mechanized. And they're like, their answer that I, did these interviews, and in their answer, many of them were like universal basic income. Nobody will be working, but people will be, supplied by the state, I guess, which is a fascinating, idea about American politics. But anyway, they come up with defenses against what they hear they are accused of, and no one is really talking about what are you doing to relationship. And so that's what's new for them. And the more thoughtful engineers that I've talked to, like the guy at USC who was talking about what's road and what's not, he's like, we're not really working with a very advanced model of relationship. He even said it's like putting lipstick on a pig. We're like kind of doing a couple of interactions and we say, that's a relationship. And so he was quite straightforward about their issues. But yeah, so it wasn't as different as I anticipated. I'll say it that way.
So I have two questions, and I'll come back to the audience for one more. But first, let me be a cynic or a skeptic for a moment.
Right on, come on.
And we've chatted about this. Okay, isn't this what people said about cars, right? When cars came into the world, people thought, oh my gosh, there's going to be this new technology. It's going to fundamentally rip at the fabric of social life, because instead of...
Which it kind of did. But anyway, yeah.
Walking down the street and having serendipitous encounters, being able to connect with neighbors, people are going to get into their car, they're going to drive to work, they're going to drive to the store, and they're going to live in this highly individualized, depersonalized world. And so I'm curious, is that what happened? Or are you just the person 100 years later who's sort of the canary about AI with cars, but 100 years from now, we might sort of think back on that and be like, well, maybe that was naive.
I don't know. Can I say, first of all, I disagree with your characterization, because I think at the time we were like, wow, cars, they go really fast, they're killing people.
Yeah, okay.
And that was the problem. They didn't realize that what they were creating was a super individualized and kind of atomized existence where we actually were allowed to live farther apart from each other. And so anyway, in retrospect, that is a perfect rendition of what cars have done. But before, I don't think people were saying that. But yes, this language, isn't this what people said about cars, is a very common argument that you will hear right now about anything criticizing AI. So I want you to hear that when you go out and be like, let's look at that, because it's actually the way they silence dissent. And there is a huge industry trying to get us to roll over and be like, it's inevitable and it's over and, you all own us already anyway, or whatever. And I want you to kind of be strong against that. So what would I say to the argument of like, isn't this what they said about cars? And the answer is, cars are a great example, because think about like Los Angeles or other cities where the introduction of cars was so kind of, we rolled for the industry so much that it destroyed an incipient and in some places developed public transportation system. So if, like there are actual cases in cities where there was a public transportation system and it was dismantled in part because, or to make room for better highways or the cars. I think in Pittsburgh, actually, there's one.
Princeton Public Library.
Yeah, like anyway, so this is so the story of cars is actually a great example, because my goal is not to eradicate AI. My goal is to actually have our hands on the steering wheel, where we decide or kind of shape the way we want it to be implemented and used. And so imagine if there had been a kind of prescient or armed, I don't mean armed, I mean kind of discursively armed populace saying, no, actually, we want public trans with some cars, or, here's a way, like, I want us to be more critical about and kind of just educated about what we want, so that we can push back at the enormous, I would say, social and political campaign that is coming our way to try and just make it able to be in every domain.
So I want to push on this just as the last
keep
thing,
going,
and then
keep
we'll
going.
have we can, as we break up, we can have a shared conversation a bit.
Yeah.
So I don't want us to leave this room without addressing the last chapter, the final sort of chapter of the book, which is where you make a call for a social movement around connective labor. So if we think of ourselves as interested parties in this phenomenon, people who maybe are sympathetic to the arguments, or at least, think this is something we might want to do something about. Like, I think when we leave a book talk, there should be an understanding of what the book was about, how it came about, and then a kind of call to action. Like, what should we do as a shared community about this to try and address some of these things, not just in our own lives, but within our broader community. So in that last chapter, you talk about this. Like, there should be a social movement for connective action. So for those of us who are interested in this as a phenomenon, like, what would that movement look like? How could we collectively build it? Or what are the sets of things that we should be doing that might help, in the absence of regulation of AI, at least push something in a direction that would make connective labor more a normal part of everyday life?
Thank you. Okay, so so the first thing I would say is, we understand that there's an idea about public health, that there's we care about, whether or not there's vaccinations and kind of masks, and what's the policy on this, and there's a fluoridization of the water and all these kind of things. There's public health as a entity, we care about it. And I actually want us all to also to care about our social health. I want us to think about, what kind of technologies and programs and practices on an individual and a social level shape the relationships that we have to each other. And that kind of calls on us to do things as, policymakers and also users and employers, like all these different levels. It calls on people to kind of commit to that. So on a user level, that's the most obvious one. And that is really to choose human when you can. And what that means, and I start off the last chapter talking about the bane of everyone's existence, self-checkout. Everyone hates self-checkout. Nobody likes self-checkout. Nonetheless, 1/3 of U.S. economic transactions in the grocery store take place in self-checkout. So we may say we're hating it, but we're actually using it. Now, it's funny, because why does self-checkout have anything to do with connective labor? And it actually does, because grocery store clerks before 1920, A, were men, and B, you handed them a list. They were in control of getting you things. and you handed them a list, and they knew who you were shopping for. And they were like, oh, how did your husband like those peppers? And, like it was actually a form of connective labor done by men in 1920 and before. And then they invented the modern, basically 1920, invented was it Piggly Wiggly? Something like that. Invented the modern supermarket where shoppers were let loose in the market, shopped, pulled, did their own choosing, and then went to the front where cashiers, all they did was ring it through. And that job became, standardized and routinized and feminized. So they became women. And that's how we got into the land of like carpal tunnel and people scripted language of, do you want paper or plastic, et cetera. So that evolution of that job is now at a place where like self-checkout doesn't feel like that much of a difference because they're already kind of roboticized as human beings. We've changed that job to make it become more rote. So choosing human is about pushing back on that process. And it's not just choosing the human checkout person, but it's choosing human whenever you can. So part of that is also being informed when you are interacting with something that is or is not human. So that's the first kind of low-level regulation I would propose is transparency, so that people will say this is AI and this is not AI. And that's right now. There's no regulation. So right now, just companies just do that when they want or when they've been forced to. So, but there's other. So the other thing I want you to do is think about when you're thinking about what kind of AI to support or to organize against or to think about or to criticize. I want you to apply that connection metric. I think that is a useful guide for us all, and maybe add it. I'm not anti the other forms of critique, the surveillance bias and job disruption, but I want you to add the connection metric to that because relationships are changing, and we need to be in charge of that. This is too important. The impact we have as humans on each other is too profound to kind of let it be automated without our consent.
Great. Well, it's noon, and so I'm sorry. I know there were so many other questions here, but hopefully we can have a conversation collectively afterwards. Allison, I want to thank you so much for being in conversation, for sharing the book, and I want to thank the library for facilitating this conversation.
Thank you so much.